He's a United States career ambassador who's lived, worked, and observed China's development for more than 70 years. Ambassador J. Stapleton Roy shares his thoughts about U.S. China relations. Hello, I'm Anand, Naidoo, and this is The Heat. Ambassador Roy has witnessed China's economic and global transformation firsthand. Roy was born in Nanjing, China, where his parents were educational missionaries and had a distinguished career in the U.S. Foreign Service, specializing in Asia affairs. He had a front seat to history when the United States and China formally established diplomatic ties in 1978, and later became a three-time ambassador, serving in China, Singapore, and Indonesia. Roy is also the founding director emeritus at the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. Ambassador Roy, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be here.
Let us start with the current state of relations between the United States and China. We do, of course, know that over the last 40 years, China embarked on a policy of reform and opening up. It's changed the country radically, major changes. Those changes were generally welcomed by the United States. There were very positive responses here to the changes in China. Yet in the last 2 years, we see tensions rising. There's now talk of a new Cold War. What is your assessment of the relationship?
I think the relationship is under greater strain than it has been at any time in the last 40 years, largely because of the remarkable success of the United States in essentially contributing to a rise of China from poverty to a remarkably modern status now. You can travel around China now and see the success of policies that we supported. The changes were brought about by the Chinese people themselves, not by the Americans. But our policies were conducive to China's rise. And when China talks about having 700 million people who've risen from poverty, the United States shares in that success because our policies were compatible with that outcome. But Americans now are worried because China has been so successful in becoming stronger and more prosperous that we now see China as our #1 strategic rival. And we haven't yet come to grips with that, and that's the big challenge for our policy.
You say Americans are now worried. So is this dispute about trade imbalances, market access, or transfers of intellectual property? Or is it, as some commentators contend, about containing China?
At the moment, it's not about containing China, but that potential is out there. I think that it would be a major policy failure for us if we let our policy slip in the direction of believing that China was such a hostile rising power that we had to engage in a containment policy. That has not been our policy. Many Chinese think it has been our policy, but we have over $600 billion of bilateral trade with China. And I used to work on Soviet affairs, and our maximum trade with the Soviet Union was something like $4 billion. So it just seems to me totally incompatible to think of what our policy has been as a containment strategy.
You know, as you point out, these changes, of course, were formulated and implemented by the Chinese over the last 40 years. We've seen the country, as you just said, lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's now the world's second biggest economy. What is your assessment of those achievements?
I think this is one of the remarkable transformations in history. For China to change from what it was back in the 1960s and 70s into the type of country which it is now. But that poses big challenges for the United States and big challenges for China. Let me illustrate. The United States has not been changing our approach to East Asia. We have the same alliance systems we've always had. We're still engaged with the world, with the region of East Asia, as we always have been. But China's relationship to the region is changing. It's become the engine of growth. That's the positive aspect of it. But China's now talking about having a world-class military by the middle of the century. What does that mean for China's neighbors? What does that mean for a country like Japan that sits next to China? These are factors that China hasn't fully sorted out. China's leaders, to their credit, talk about the security dilemma. The security dilemma is when you are totally secure yourself, you are so strong that your neighbors are not secure. And this is a problem that China is aware of, but has not yet developed policies to deal with effectively.
So is there a belief in the United States that China's intention in developing its military is to dominate the region?
Yes, that is the belief. I do not share that belief. I think China's leaders are too smart to think that a region that has never been dominated by a single country. Remember, even when China was the so-called Central Kingdom, it did not control the maritime portions of Asia. That includes Japan, what is now Indonesia, it includes the Philippines. China was the land power, and that's where its central role was most dominant.
Because I'm wondering if there is a feeling in the United States that China is trying to be a dominant power in that part of the world. Where is the evidence of that?
Well, Chinese leaders give a lot of speeches. And in those speeches, I do not find evidence that China wants to drive the United States out of East Asia. The United States has been a factor in East Asia from our birth as a republic over 200 years ago. And I think it would be remarkably unwise for China to think that somehow the United States is going to pull back across the Pacific. When we have not been fully engaged in East Asia, we have found that we have had to fight our way back into East Asia. And that's not a situation that would be good for us, and it wouldn't be good for China.
Certainly, China has been taking an increasing or playing an increasing role in international affairs. If you look at the role it plays in forums like the United Nations, the G7, APEC, for instance. Let's listen to President Xi Jinping in his New Year's address to the nation. Let's watch.
世界看到了
The world has seen a China whose reforms and opening up have gathered speed and has seen China's determination to follow through with reforms and opening up. Our pace of reforms will not stagnate, and the door to opening up will widen further.
So China is saying the reform doesn't stop here. It's going to continue. Are you in any way surprised at the progress that the country has made?
Yes, I am surprised, because I'm familiar with a lot of countries. I'm familiar with our own history. We rose rapidly, but no country has risen as rapidly as China has over the last 40 years. So in that sense, I'm surprised. But I've always thought that the Chinese had the capability to do what they have done, but it required leaders who had the vision, and it required policies that pushed China in the right direction. Here's where I'm concerned about China, because a lot of China's success has been essentially changing the nature of its economy, introducing market forces, and those have been the most productive aspects of China's economy. But now we see movement away from that. We have the remarkable economic reforms that were set out at the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee back 5 years ago. But those reforms have not been pushed forward. And in fact, we see a strengthening of the state sector in China and less attention to the market-driven forces, the private sector. I think that that's a movement in the wrong direction. And I think it would be negative for China and for the United States if China seemed to be moving back to a statist type of approach.
Yet what China is doing right now would seem to point in the other direction. It's opening up its market to foreign investors. We've just heard that at these trade talks that have been taking place. It's welcoming people into China. It's loosening restrictions on economic activity in the country.
Well, the trade talks haven't yet concluded, so we don't know what's going to come out of the trade talks. I think it would be a major positive thing for both the United States and China if the trade talks were successful, if China agreed to address some of the issues that have caused the American business community, that used to be one of the strongest supporters of the bilateral relationship, but over the last 5 years, they have turned sour because they believe that the fairness in the relationship was no longer there, that they were not getting the benefits that they expected to have in terms of a market-driven economy. That's a major negative factor in the U.S. China relationship, because when the business community no longer supports the engagement strategy, it becomes more difficult for our leaders to carry out that policy and sustain it.
All right, I want to get back to that in a moment, but let's go back to the start of your relationship with China. Yeah. You were born there. You lived there during the Second World War. In fact, you witnessed the Battle of Shanghai. What was China like at that time?
It was an impoverished country. I spent 7 years during World War II in Chengdu, China. Chengdu is the capital of what at that time was China's most populous province. Outside of the city, which was a walled city, there were no paved roads, all dirt. Inside the city, cobblestones. It was not a modern city. Because of the conditions there were the transportation were rickshaws, which drawn by human beings. Pedicabs, the bicycle-driven things, you didn't see in Chengdu in those days. We lived just outside the city where the university community was located, and we were surrounded by agricultural land. If you look at Chengdu now on the map, where we lived, which was outside what was then the urban area of Chengdu, looks as though it's the bullseye in the middle of the city, because the city has expanded out. At that time, the population might have been 500,000 people. Now it's over 10 million people. So this is indicative of the types of changes that have taken place. It was every morning we would see pigs tied up in wicker baskets being wheeled on wheelbarrows by people with big straps over their shoulders to market. That was Chengdu in those days, and this was the capital of a major province. So contrast that now with what you see in China.
It's unrecognizable. Then, of course, came the 70s, Richard Nixon making that historic trip to China. You were involved in the early negotiations that led to the restoration of diplomatic relations. What were the major issues that were discussed at that time when the United States was considering normalizing its relationship with China, restoring those diplomatic relations?
The big issue was Taiwan. The other issues existed. We had claims against each other. We had both governmental claims and private claims that had to be settled. But the blocking factor in terms of getting diplomatic relations was the fact that the Civil War had not ended. There was an alternative government of China that was located in Taiwan and only controlled Taiwan and a few islands in the East China Sea. So that we had a friendly relationship with that government. We had a mutual defense treaty with it, and we had military forces stationed on, not major forces, but we had a military presence on Taiwan. And we recognized in the course of the negotiations that we would have to break relations with that government, that we would have to end the security treaty, and that we would have to withdraw our military forces. So the problem was working out a way to do that in a way that was compatible with what we could do and with what China could accept.
You were also, of course, very close to the National Security Advisor initially, Henry Kissinger. He then became Secretary of State. What was his role in the establishment of these relations?
His role and that of President Nixon was to get the breakthrough to China so that we could engage in a way that could potentially lead to the establishment of diplomatic relations. But the actual negotiations that produced the diplomatic relationship were conducted by President Carter's administration. At the time, it was Cyrus Vance, who was the Secretary of State, but the dominant role in the Carter administration was played by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the National Security Advisor.
And what was the feeling on the American side about the people that they were talking to in China, the Deng Xiaoping administration, and their response to what was coming from the United States?
Well, that's what the negotiations were designed to find out. The formal negotiations began in July of 1978. And they were so secret that only Ambassador Woodcock, who was the head of the liaison office, and I, who was the deputy head of the liaison office, knew they were taking place. None of our fellow staff members were aware that we were actually engaging in these negotiations.
Why the secrecy? Was there concern in the United States? Was there domestic concerns here about restoring relations with China?
Well, before we began the negotiations, we briefed the very top leadership in Congress as to what our bottom line was. And this included breaking the relationship with Taiwan, maintaining unofficial relations with Taiwan, but no longer having an official relationship with the government on the island, and included ending the security treaty and withdrawing our military forces. And they said, you were doing the right thing, but we will criticize you. In other words, the mood in Congress was, yes, it was not right for the United States to be recognizing a little island off of the coast of China as the government of all of China. But on the other hand, they liked Taiwan, and they were not prepared to openly call for what they knew we had to do. So if the negotiations had leaked, Congress would have taken a hostile attitude publicly, even though privately they thought we were doing the right thing. So that's why it was so essential to maintain the secrecy, because it could have been scuttled if once it was done, and Congress accepted it. But in the process of doing it, if Congress had found out about it, it would have had to publicly criticize it.
Right, then we fast forward, of course, to the election and emergence of Donald Trump. Almost immediately, the tone changes. We hear this harsh rhetoric coming out of the White House, criticism of China. President Trump accuses China of taking advantage of the United States. Did any of that surprise you?
Well, virtually everything about President Trump has surprised me, because we have not had a president like him in our history. But one of the factors that I think that has enabled him to have a positive impact to a certain degree is that he respects power, and he respects big countries. And both China and Russia are big countries, powerful countries, important countries. They happen to have political systems that we don't like. But President Trump is more impressed by the fact that these are important countries that we have to get along with. And that has put him at odds with Congress, for example, in dealing with Russia. And with China, he puts particular value on his relationship with President Xi Jinping, and that has been a stabilizing factor in the bilateral relationship. But unlike Russia, we have enormous economic interests with China, and particularly in the trade area. And President Trump has decided that the growing dissatisfaction in the United States, in Congress, in the business community, over the trade relationship with China needed to be addressed. And so this is the balance we have in the relationship with China now. There's great mutual respect for each other, but at the same time, we are locked in this bitter trade war designed to try to get our trade relationship onto a more sustainable basis. And we have a deadline of March 1st, right, and we have a negotiating team that's been in Beijing, and it's very possible the leading China trade negotiator, Liu He, will come to Washington in order to wrap up the negotiations. And I'm hopeful that they will be successful in getting an interim agreement. We're not going to solve all the problems, but if we can get ourselves on the right track to dealing with these problems, it will be enormously beneficial for the both sides.
The fact that the Chinese vice premier may be here in Washington as these talks continue, what does that tell you?
It shows that this is a very important relationship for China as well. And their trade relationship with the United States really matters. As you know, China's economy has been slowing down, and this is not entirely attributable to the trade war, but the trade war has certainly made the slowing down more painful for China, but it's also been painful for the United States.
Yeah, in fact, you know, it's something that President Xi has said, because shortly after President Trump took office, and we heard this criticism of China, the Chinese were very quick to respond. This was President Xi talking at the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. Let's watch.
It's true that economic globalization has created new problems, but this is not justification to write it off altogether. Rather, we should adapt to and guide economic globalization. Pursuing protectionism is like locking oneself in a dark room. Wind and rain may be kept outside, but so is light and air. No one will emerge as a winner in a trade war.
What do you make of that sentiment that no one will emerge as a winner in a trade war? Is there a recognition of this in the United States?
No. Some people think that, but the administration does not. The administration has concluded that a trade war with China was necessary in order to force China to address the issues that we felt were not being addressed in the bilateral relationship. I personally feel that you needed to increase pressure on China in order to get the issues addressed that had to be addressed. But I would not have chosen tariffs as the right way to deal with this problem. But when you're a big, strong, economically powerful country like the United States, sometimes you can use the wrong methods and still get positive results out of it. So this is where I am ambivalent about the approach that the administration has chosen to take. I don't exclude the possibility that we can get a good outcome from it, but I think that the pain that has been inflicted on a host of Americans and on a host of Chinese through using tariffs, which after all are a tax on the American people, as the way to put pressure on China, is perhaps not the best approach.
You know, the broad parameters of American foreign policy changed under President Trump. He has been talking of America first. Some have called it isolationism or a look inwards. And to what extent does that influence the policy towards China?
Well, you know, I was an American diplomat for nearly half a century. And I do not recall a single instant during that 50-year period or 45-year period when I was officially in the government in which we didn't have America first in terms of our approach to every issue we were dealing with. I think what has changed is President Trump is announcing America first as our foreign policy, whereas historically our foreign policy has felt that we were advancing America's interests by taking into account the interests of other countries. Because we are most successful when other countries benefit from our success. And that means we have to advance American interests as our first priority by taking into account and accommodating the interests of other countries. So rhetorically, at the moment, we are not taking that approach. And I think that's a flaw in the way that the Trump administration is dealing with the rest of the world. But the idea that America should always be primarily concerned about our own interests has been embedded in the diplomatic history of the United States that I am familiar with.
Ambassador, we have a few minutes left. I want to look at the future. We're looking at the trade talks taking place right now. The deadline has been set for March 1st. How important is it for there to be some kind of agreement? And where do you see the relationship go to from there?
I think it's very important that we get some sort of agreement out of the current negotiations. We've set this March 1st deadline. I think that's achievable. There's indications from the Chinese side that they're prepared to try to accommodate some of our interests. I don't think we should let the talks fail because it won't be good for the economies of China or the United States. And I think it's possible to get an agreement. So I am optimistic that we will come up with something. But we shouldn't think that this will solve the problem. What it will do is make the problem manageable. And the problem was becoming unmanageable. And I think that, as an American, I think China bears a significant responsibility for failing to recognize how a positive force for the U.S. China relationship, our business community, was becoming hostile because of the way that they were being treated in the trade relationship with China.
But was there also a failure on the part of the Americans to recognize that China's emergence as a major economic power, its integration into the United States economy, was beneficial not for just the two countries, but for the world as a whole?
I very strongly believe that. In fact, I'm disturbed by the talk you hear from the administration about trying to de-link our economy from China and trying to break up the global supply chains that have been part of globalization. I think that is a remarkably wrong approach because globalization has negative consequences in terms of job shifts that occur because you can take advantage of comparative advantage on a global scale and not simply on a national scale. We've had the same problem within the United States on a national scale during our process of development, when jobs moved from one region to another. And we didn't address that problem adequately. But the fact of the matter is that our consumers have all benefited from that. Longer-term relationship. The biggest problem at the moment is a growing belief, which is wrong in my judgment, that engagement with China failed and that we need to adopt a containment strategy and hold China down. It's the wrong approach. I think the United States is the best positioned country in the world to deal with a stronger and more prosperous China. And there's absolutely no reason, because it's in the U.S. national interest, to avoid the consequences of a hostile relationship with China. So we need leaders who recognize that, and those leaders have to be not only in the White House, but in Congress and in our, shall we say, foreign policy elite community to understand that. And the moment we don't have that consensus, and so therefore there's a big challenge for American foreign policy in trying to understand how we can deal with China in a way that will be the most beneficial in terms of our own longer-term interests.
One final question, Ambassador, and that is, will there ever be a time in the United States when it could see China as an equal?
Yes. In fact, the danger is that we see China as more equal than we are, because China, after all, has set the goal of raising its per capita GDP to European levels by the middle of the century. And that means China's economy will be bigger than ours.
Well, in fact, there was a report that just came out, put together by Standard Chartered Bank in London, which said that by 2030, the Chinese economy would be the biggest in the world, followed by India's. Number 3 would be the United States.
Well, it depends on how you measure it. If you use the purchasing power parity measurement, China's economy is already larger than ours. But at the moment, I would say we're roughly equal in terms of economic size. But the Chinese population is 4.5 times larger than the population of the United States. So we are still a much wealthier country than China is at the present time. But China down the road, if it's able to sustain its rapid economic growth, will not only have a larger economy than we have, but it will have comparable levels of prosperity to what we have now. So this is a big challenge for us. And I think working with China is the best way to address that China. Opposing China gets you into a zero-sum game, and I think economic cooperation is a non-zero-sum game.
Ambassador Roy, thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
And that is it for this edition of The Heat, but the conversation continues online. Join us on CGTN America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CGTN America. I'm Anand in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.